Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about stress testing games. This is another question from DeQuiz, who, when giving me a few topic suggestions for upcoming videos, recommended stress testing games. Now let me tell you what that is. It's mostly about testing games against min-spec machines, but a little more than that. It is not QA. I've talked about quality assurance testing. I have a couple videos I'll link below about how we did QA for the Outer Worlds. But this is about, when I talk about stress testing a game, it's about making sure they work with a wide variety of machines beyond just min-spec. But frequently it is min-spec. So the two are related. I do have a video about min-spec as well. It's linked below. Stress testing games, you have to think of all the variety of ways that you could make a game slow, you could make a game unreliable, and yes, even crashy. So I will divide this into the part of the machine that you target, and then how you kind of handle that. So let's start with CPUs. There's always been a wide variety of computer central processing units, motherboards. When I'm talking about CPU, I'm really talking about the motherboard having a main computer chip, a bus, and RAM. There's so many ways that can vary. You could have a fast chip on a motherboard with a slow bus, meaning the interaction between it and RAM is very slow, and it and the other cards and peripherals are slow. You could have a slow CPU with a fast bus. You could have lots of RAM. You could have a little bit of RAM. You could have lots of slow RAM, or you could have lots of fast RAM. There's a lot of ways that can vary, and you need to test all these configurations, especially you try to look for the worst configuration. What's a low CPU with a slow bus and the smallest amount of RAM you can run on, and it's very slow RAM to boot. Sometimes you even want to test buggy RAM, meaning you have memory that occasionally malfunctions, like you store a 0 in it and you get back a 1. I've even tested against buggy CPUs. There was a chip that came out that didn't do division correctly. This is really hard to deal with. And when you have bad hardware like that, the best you can hope for is to fail gracefully. That when an error occurs caused by a CPU malfunctioning or RAM report giving back a bad value, the best you can do is like, hey, I saw this interrupt fire. I got this bad value. Sometimes you can get something from a CPU called NaN, not a number. Or you got a number that's well outside the range. Like you're like, hey, I need to know how big this piece of art is. And it's like, it's 4 billion bytes wide. No, just fail. You just try to fail gracefully. There's a lot of other things you want to test to make sure that your game works well. You want to test how long it takes to load a save game or make a save game. You want to test how long it changes to switch maps, load different instances. You want to look at frame rate. You want to look at UI speed. UI speed is really important because one of the things that humans respond to is if they click a button on the keyboard or on the controller or on the mouse, they want to see something happen. They want to have a very fast response. So I've worked with, in the past, sometimes with UI designers that make such complex design that it's hard to get that up quickly. So you end up either preloading the UI, like the art associated with it, which is usually the biggest thing you have to load, or you make it so that when you press the button, you immediately get an audio and often a video feedback. Like it goes dink and maybe something pops up, a frame pops up, and then it fills in with art. That's just something you have to do. Similarly, with game startup time, games used to take... There was a period where they were very small, so you click the executable and it would just start right up. Then we got into this period where we had big games that were slow to load. And even now, occasionally, you start up a game that takes a while to load. So what happens is you make a launcher, a very tiny executable, that launches quickly, puts up a splash screen, and then loads your game. And that's why sometimes you start a game and it will just pop up something and it's saying, we're loading. And that's so that you get instant feedback when you click on a game and say, I want to play that. Similarly to the CPU, let's talk about GPUs, which is your video card. all the same things can happen there. You can have fast GPUs, you can have slow GPUs, you can have GPUs, video cards that don't have a lot of RAM on them. You can end up with GPUs that allow various resolutions. And of course, the higher resolution you have, the more pixels it has to draw and the longer that takes. You can also have multiple amounts of pipelines. GPUs in recent years, not even that recent, last 20 years, have gotten multiple pipelines so they can do graphics processing in parallel. Sometimes you can have a card that's got a decently fast GPU but has a lot of pipelines, meaning it can handle a lot of graphics work in parallel. The pipelines matter sometimes as much as the speed of the GPU and how much RAM is on the GPU. GPUs are often used now for offloading work from the CPU, which is why you hear about it a lot for mining Bitcoin and other stuff like that. Sorry, the dog's sleeping. When people are mining digital currency, because a lot of that gets offloaded onto your GPU because it's got a lot of RAM and a lot of pipelines and you can parallelize it. The hard drive is another piece of hardware you need to look at because there are a lot of bad ones out there. There are a lot of ones that run at a very low speed, a very low RPM. Even the fastest hard drive is kind of slow compared to a solid state drive, an SSD. You've got to check your game on all of them. You do have to make sure too that things can't load too quickly. This is something that you've probably played a game where, an older game where if you play on a machine that's too fast and the frame rate's too high, sometimes physics gets off and all that. Same thing can happen with a hard drive. If things load faster than they thought they would load, it may be that a game was written to start loading art and then would go off and do some other calculations, thinking it could easily finish those calculations before that stuff could get loaded. And then on newer machines, that's not true. Back in the day, in addition to hard drives, we had to sometimes load your game off of a floppy or even a CD-ROM. And let me just tell you, that was painstakingly slow. So you really, really try to encourage people when they installed the game to move it onto their hard drive. Let me tell you that floppies and CD-ROMs often had read errors, and some brands of CD-ROMs were so bad with this that they would literally get 5, 10, 20 read errors in a row. And then finally go, okay, you wanted to read that data, here it is. It was so bad that when we shipped Stonekeep at Interplay, I wrote an assembly level critical error handling routine to handle the problems we were having with some brands of CD-ROM drives. I think I ended up having to put an upper limit of 100 reads before it would give up, because some of them were that bad. Again, just a way of how hardware can throw errors at your game that have nothing to do with your game. Your game can be flawless, but still encounter errors. Related to what I've just talked about with both hard drives and GPUs especially, monitors. Back in the day, we had to deal with CRT versus LCD, basically cathode ray tube monitors versus LCD monitors, because they had different aspect ratios. They had wildly different resolutions. Even today, you end up with the same thing happening with some monitors can't support the resolutions that your GPU can do, or vice versa. Or your monitor uses a different input than your GPU has plugs for. This is especially true with older hardware. Standards change. You may end up with a DVI plug and your monitor doesn't have that as an in, or your GPU doesn't have that or your video card doesn't have that as an out. You can end up with monitors that have different aspect ratios. They make those big curved monitors now. Monitors have different color reproduction, different gamma levels, different black levels. So literally when you say, I just want a black pixel, some monitors will display that as a very dark gray. So things can look very different. You have to test all those. You have to stress test to make sure your game still looks good and is viewable on those monitors with those GPUs under varying lighting conditions in offices. A thing that used to be a bigger problem than it is now is sound. Back in the day, horrible. So many sound cards. Even machines that didn't have sound cards. Machines that just had a speaker. And you had to do all the sound with beeps and boops through that speaker, or try to do something called pulse width modulation to try to get really awful sounding voice and digital music to come out of that speaker. Sound processing can also be really expensive, and you had limited CPU cycles back then, so you tried to offload as much of the card as you could, but different cards did different things. And then when you throw on top of that these cards ran on interrupts that sometimes you couldn't know. You couldn't ask the card what interrupt it was on. The human had to know. The game player had to know when your game started up. You had to say, I think you got a Sound Blaster card, but you're going to have to tell me what interrupt it's put on. It's just... And then you had to test. When you were stress testing, you had to take all those cards that could work on different interrupts and put them on different interrupts to make sure it all worked. Now, mostly that stuff is standardized. There's even on-board sound. Most of the time, you don't even think about it anymore. But you still think about it a little. Now let's talk about peripherals. There's a lot of things that get connected into your computer that your game has to know about. Mice, keyboards, controllers. And you may think a lot of that has been standardized, and a lot of the input from them has been standardized. But you still have some mice that don't have center clicks. If you're on a Mac, sometimes you don't even have a right click. There are mouse wheels. There are side wheels. There are extra buttons on mice. There are extra buttons on keyboards, on controllers. You have to worry about click speed. Some mice can be clicked faster than others. Some keyboards can be typed on faster than others. That's even true for controllers. Apple had this great human-machine interaction guideline that we used to follow, so that when a human would double-click, you knew what a double-click meant, how fast and how slow the gap could be between those two clicks before it counted as a double-click or two separate clicks. You also have to worry about what happens when those peripherals get disconnected. You see that in consoles all the time, especially with wireless controllers. How does your game handle it when the wireless controller loses its battery? Or just for whatever loses its connection, or a plugged-in peripheral gets unplugged? How do you handle that? A lot of that is part of the... when you submit a game for certification, that's part of the certification. They will test that when they know your game and they're just unplug the keyboard or the controller or the mouse and make sure you react correctly. A lot of that is standardized now, but it's still stuff you have to do in stress testing. Online has once you decide you want to make a multiplayer game, you're going to make it be online. You've got a bunch more stress testing you have to do. You have to deal with bad internet speeds. You can have internet speeds that are variable. You can have high speed ones, which means the ping is low, but the bandwidth is tiny, meaning you get lots of packets, but they're very tiny. You can also have the reverse happen, where you can have really big bandwidth, but a very low ping, meaning you get very large packets of information, but you don't get them very often, or worse, you don't get them consistently, which just makes games that are trying to deal with human input very hard to make smooth. You also have to deal with dropout. What happens when people lose internet? Sometimes people used to do that deliberately. They were losing a multiplayer game, so they'd unplug their net card. You have to deal with that. When we were doing WildStar and we wanted to test it with lots of players online, one of the programmers made what we called a headless client, which would connect into our server and just mimic a player logging in, running around, attacking things, picking up and dropping items, basically just anything that required server-side interaction, so we could stress test our server. We didn't worry about client. We gave the client a min spec and we tested the client separately, but you would also have to stress test your server. Luckily, you could control the server specs, so if you were like, ooh, we really need a more powerful server, that would be something the programmers would tell us, and we'd buy more powerful servers, usually with more powerful CPUs and much bigger, much greater amounts of RAM. Servers didn't have graphics. That was all handled on the client side. Keep in mind, the client side would have to do all the previous testing I mentioned, and then the server side would have to do all the previous stuff except probably the graphics and peripheral testing. So, the quiz. I hope that answered your question. That's a lot of the stress testing. I tried to think of everything I could, and as you can see, it's related to min-spec, but it's not quite min-spec testing. So I don't know, I'm surprised I've never talked about this before, but again, it's one of those things that it never occurred to me to talk about because it's just so baked in to game development process, and something that surprises, I think, a lot of indies when they're, quote, done with their game, and then they put it out there and they discover it doesn't work on a lot of combinations of peripherals and GPUs and CPUs and everything that people have on different computers out there. Anyway, I hope this answered your question to quiz, and hope you liked it.